Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome back to another episode of 2020 presidential election stuff. And instead of updating my model, well, I have updated it, but instead of showing you all that, I want to talk about something a little bit different because we're not entirely sure how long this quarantine slash stay at home, whatever you want to call it, is going to last. So I kind of want to talk about what happens if this lasts long enough to actually interfere with the election. Okay? Because that is a legitimate concern at this point in time. The obvious answer is that a lot of people are going to stay at home and turnout is going to be depressed. This is assuming that the election is held as normal and the Supreme Court rules that you have to continue to allow in-person voting and not go full mail-in in states that don't already have it. If that's the case, well, obviously, let's switch that to Phil. Okay, there we go. Basically, any state that is safe Democratic is probably going to stay that way. I could actually, I'll talk about why I'm not filling in Illinois. This means turnout is going to decrease, okay? And decreased turnout is almost always good for Republicans. Because Republican voters they're just going to say, well, it's more important that we vote and we'll deal with the consequences later, right? So I could honestly see, I'm not even going to I'll talk about the 2nd Congressional District. Okay, for right now, I'll just, oops, goddamn it. Basically, and I'm going to go ahead and fill in all the safe Republican states. I'm not counting Texas as 100% safe just because there's a lot of weird stuff going on with Texas, and it is trending blue. It's actually becoming, I would argue, a battleground state. But you'll notice that this is a wider map than I would normally consider, especially Illinois, and I'll talk about why. Actually, California would almost certainly be safe blue regardless, but turnout is especially going to wind up being a lot lower in urban areas because it's going to be extremely hard to practice any social distancing, stuff like that. In addition, I honestly see urban areas being more inclined to following these stay-at-home orders even during an election. Whereas in rural areas, people are going to be, we're just not going to care. I may live in a town or even some people would call it a city, but basically I step outside the limits and it's extremely rural. So yeah, no, this is there would be a lot of concern here. Chicago, New York, L.A., San Diego. That said, the fact of the matter is, it's going to be a situation where we could see a map that probably shouldn't happen. I'd almost say Georgia would be safe because a lot of voters in Atlanta probably aren't going to turn out. Rural voters, while their turnout will be slightly depressed, it won't be near as much as the urban areas. Texas, I'm going to put that in the safe. Now, this is just one possible scenario, right? Ohio and Iowa would almost certainly be in that category. I'm going to put Florida in the likely category and North Carolina too. Arizona in that same boat. And remember, this is just normal when turnout is depressed, and with the amount that it could be depressed for something like this, it could be even more dramatic than this. So we could honestly be talking about a situation where I need to use this tool, and it's just it is a little bit difficult to do this properly. Oops, I want it here. Some states that are generally not competitive could become so. Now, this is just a crazy scenario. Let's say that nothing happens. Well, okay, that's to be expected at this stage. By the way, Nebraska, we probably wouldn't have any real change in the 2nd congressional district. It'd still be red. So, but I don't think that is as likely, nor as I don't think that's a particularly likely scenario. I think turnout will be depressed and it will aid the Republicans, but maybe not that much, right? The other option is what happens if the Supreme Court not only allows this, but says, or each state's governors decide, okay, we don't feel comfortable holding this election given what the Supreme Court might do vis-a-vis their decision in Wisconsin earlier this year, actually earlier this month. And let's just appoint the electors for the Electoral College, which, by the way, can still be done. And we're going to appoint our electors through the state legislatures as, originally was done, right? In which case, every state that has a Democratic majority will, in their state legislature, will do this. Massachusetts, Vermont, New York. Actually, New Hampshire has it. Maine has it. By the way, this deprives the Republicans of that one vote in Maine, but the Democrats get deprived of the one vote in Nebraska. If I remember correctly, Montana is like that. And remember, it's the state legislatures, not the state governments as a whole. And, well, as you can see, it doesn't matter. Except for, Minnesota and Alaska have a weird situation where control is split. So, you could potentially see a situation where they force where Republicans and Democrats compromise in both of those states. This would actually improve Trump's electoral vote total. Minnesota might not do that, however, because if it's done by the lower chambers, we could see something like this be the electoral vote count. But it gets even weirder, because what if they decide, well, you have to have the governor's approval? Well, we could see a situation. I'm going to go ahead and clear this. If I remember the situation correctly, I'm going to highlight every state with a Democratic governor. And every state with a Republican governor. Sorry. Because, Mississippi has a Democratic governor. And if you remember, now this of course would lead to a Democratic win, right? But it's not that simple. Because in the states with split control of their state governments, you could see compromises forced. In order to get their votes in on time. Now, Alaska is kind of weird because everybody thinks that, because of the way they do things. Actually, they would have Republican control, but it's actually a coalition government with 6 Republicans, all of the Democrats in their state, and there we go. And the two of the independents, right? There we go. Oops. There we go. And of course, I'm giving precedence to the state legislatures party. But you could see a map that looks like this with quite a few states with split electoral votes. And this would lead to a very competitive situation. Again, I'm not entirely positive this is likely. This would be assuming the governor has, say, veto power. But in a lot of places, I would assume that the state legislatures would override something like that, right? So Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, I could actually see splitting like this, right? And being 2-2. Maine won't split. Delaware won't split. Maryland wouldn't. Virginia won't. Hawaii. I don't see New Mexico, Colorado, or Nevada doing it. Again, I'm going to be covering every state with a effective trifecta. I'll split Alaska's just because I think that's, again, because a compromise would make sense. Iowa is entirely Republican controlled. Actually, I'll come back to Mississippi and Louisiana. Actually, no, I won't, because the legislatures would probably override that veto. And same thing with Kentucky. I would assume similar thing in Montana, Georgia, North Carolina. I could see them overriding it. Wisconsin, it's a little bit more even, but so I would split those actually. Michigan, we would almost certainly see a split. Pennsylvania, I could foresee a split simply because there's not a large enough majority and they would want to. The weird thing is that that Minnesota would almost be forced to, because Republicans only control one chamber and they can basically not approve of that. Now, some people said it would just be the lower assembly, in which case it was the first map where it was basically the 16 map minus the congressional districts and Alaska, and I think there was one vote somewhere that I'm missing. That was weird. But I could see something like this happening as well, which, there's some really interesting scenarios that are possible given the what would happen if states decided to do presidential elections this year the old way, where you had the state legislatures appoint the electors rather than a popular vote for the electors of that state. And Maine and Nebraska do their own thing, of course. So I just wanted to kind of go over this weird quirk, and it would actually be a good use of the Electoral College, because at the end of the day, guess what? It means that, and this is one of the arguments to actually keep the Electoral College, is that in a crisis where you can't hold elections as normal, in order to meet the terms, the truth is, in order to meet the terms, what we'd have is a situation where what we'd have is a situation where you would have where you would have to, such as a global pandemic or potentially even, I don't know, a civil war or something like that. But, it's an argument in favor of the Electoral College. Now, I'm also going to cover what would happen in the event that the elections maybe do get canceled and we don't go through with the old school way of choosing it, and instead states refuse it. Well, it's kind of interesting, but the governors in a lot of states would have the power to appoint House representatives, and this could lead to an interesting situation. So every state with a Republican governor, and by the way, that's going to lead to some interesting maps, because of course they're going to appoint Republicans in every seat, right? And Democrats are going to appoint Democrats in every seat, right? But why does this matter? Well, I actually haven't done the math. And they could choose a president, because Trump's term ends on January 20th, whether he wants it to or not. And the question is whether or not he will get a second term, right? And you could argue that this wouldn't happen, and it almost certainly won't, but again, it's something that we have to ask ourselves. And the reason why is because I saw a video from a guy who was asking, well, what happens if we can't hold the elections? Who's president on January 20th in the event of a canceled election and no Electoral College meeting? Well, there's some really weird situations, because guess what? Cabinet positions don't. North Carolina's governor is up, governor's race is open, but I'll assume that he'd still be able to appoint legislators the day, because I believe his term ends after the legislative appointments happen. So we will, of course, see course, we pick Republicans. Oh, I forgot Maryland. Maryland has a Republican governor. So I kind of derped there. Right? And then, did I forget any? No, I don't believe I did. So you'd have a really weird House map for 2 years. Because guess what? Since they were appointed, there would be no special to a term, there would be no special election. At least as far as I understand the way House appointments work. Because most states do a special election instead of an appointment, but in extreme circumstances they can do an appointment which lasts until now, of course, the other option that could happen is Republican is that everybody just reappoints their current House delegation. But I think that's less likely than a situation where full partisanship is granted, right? Or full partisan appointments. But it could potentially help moderate both parties to an extent, though I'm skeptical on the Democratic one. The Republican one, I am more amenable to arguments stating that they could be moderated by this sort of thing. Because both Hogan, Larry Hogan, Phil Scott, and Charlie Baker are both fairly, I'd almost argue, liberal Republicans. Now, of course, this map would swing dramatically during the midterms, of course. And we'd see a lot of seats flip, but that would be to be expected, right? Right. So you would have a narrow Democratic majority in the House. And that would mean that, guess what? That would mean that Nancy Pelosi would be the Speaker of the House. Now, both Trump and Pence, their terms would end. And with no election, that they can't say, oh, it's extended. No, they can't do that because that's not how the Constitution works. So the next in line is the Speaker of the House, and that would almost certainly be Nancy Pelosi. But which would, cause a lot of consternation. And then the next in line would almost certainly be, if we go to the Senate map, here we go, Senate. So Republicans are already there. Again, states with a Republican governor, we are going to, appoint Republicans in. And states with a Democratic governor, we're going to appoint Democrats in. And obviously, this leads to a Democratic majority. The next in line would then more than likely be Patrick Leahy of Vermont, the president pro tempore of the Senate, who would become the president pro tempore of the Senate. Sorry, the current president pro tempore is Chuck Grassley of Iowa, because the Republicans have control of the chamber. So Democrats would get a trifecta, effectively. Though we do have to take off 2 because of Angus King and Bernie Sanders, who are independents, but they do caucus with the Democratic Party. Which this would have a lot of implications. Democrats would actually really like this scenario, I bet. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of problems with it. Right? Because, I mean, I hate those ads. There's just a lot of weirdness, right? I don't think any of this will happen. I think the election will go as normal, for the most part. But I see turnout being slightly depressed, and that does not portend well for the Democratic Party. I think that would be just enough to give Trump a win. I mean, I think he has a slight edge right now, but I think it would be enough to flip a small number of states, and make the margins closer in states with major population centers like Illinois and of course, when I say that, I mean there'd be a large divide between, I can see Nevada flipping, but I won't do it for this video. States with a large divide between a liberal population in a large urban area and a conservative population outside of that. That could actually matter for Virginia. It could flip, but you would need really depressed turnout in Nova and Richmond. But something like this would not be outside the realm of possibility for depressed turnout, because at the end of the day, like I stated at the start of this video, depressed turnout does benefit Republicans. So, anyway, as always, if you like the content, likes, comments, subscriptions always do help. I greatly appreciate them. See if we can reach 400 by the end of the month. I want to thank all y'all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time. Bye.